All right, can you guys hear me? Russell?
Yes, can hear you loud and clear.
D-Dog, D-Dog, you can hear me there. All right, welcome to the first episode of our little podcast that we got going on over here. The podcast is being called Reactionary Opinions. Our catchphrase is God wills it. It's basically a podcast where we challenge the most important aspects of how to live life like a reactionary, how to be a good, solid Christian conservative. And obviously we look at current affairs, political affairs, and all of that, and how that ties into living a good conservative life and the importance of living a good conservative life. But before we get into the topic of the day, I think we should just introduce ourselves, tell our listeners a little bit about ourselves and what we're about. D-Dog, you want to go first, bro?
Sure. I'm the one dirty foreigner of the group. I'm Dylan, and I am by education, studied history and education. And currently I live in South Africa, and I moved here about 2 years ago. I met these guys through various sort of libertarian, classical liberal forums, and then we all got disgusted with the degeneracy of liberalism, and here we are.
Russell?
Yes, I am the elder brother Russell. I have my background professionally. I've studied and worked in accounting, finance, and taxation for the last 20 years. Always been interested in how nations develop through history, historical influences, how nations are sustained, what is sustainable, what are good laws, what are bad laws, how can we improve things, and but at the same time also applying my Christian faith to those areas of life as well. So that's where I come from.
Excellent. And I'm Scott. I'm the younger bald brother, and I'm basically a shit stirrer in a nutshell. I'm an oak that's a natural skeptic, always been a skeptic, never taken any answer literally, always had to question everything. And I think that's what led me to where I am today. Started off as I guess you'd call a libertarian, borderline libertarian, but I was always on the fence. And the same as Dylan said, started realizing that it just doesn't add up. Especially having to live my life as a Christian man and a conservative. It just didn't add up, and we'll get into that throughout our podcast and stuff. So don't judge us too harshly, the soybitarians.
Yes, I can hear the I can see the torches from here. Yes.
Yeah, pitchforks and torches are coming out. So Dylan, do you want to just run through? I know that the topic for discussion this evening is free speech, but free speech in a much more broader perspective, and we're going to have a very, very interesting discussion. I think a discussion that a lot of people haven't really heard, that side of the discussion, something that not many people have touched on, and I think it's an interesting thing and an important thing to touch on. So Dylan, do you want to just sort of start us off on the bullet points that we're going to be touching on today, and then we'll sort of take the discussion from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll just sort of outline the general flow of our conversation tonight, hit all the main points, and we'll just kind of go through them one by one. What do you guys think?
Absolutely, down with that.
All right, cool. So our topic for tonight is free speech in general, with 3 key questions. First, what happens when you stifle free speech? The bad, and because the show is called Reactionary Opinions, the good.
Yeah.
Is free speech absolutism sustainable? And question 3, what speech, if any, is bad? So I guess we'll just start with the first one. What happens when you stifle free speech? I've sort of taken some notes tonight, so just to sort of help me, maybe help us sort of not get too far off in the weeds, and then talk about, constitutional monarchy and God-ordained emperors and stuff like that. So we'll just stick with speech tonight. So first question, what happens when you stifle free speech?
Okay.
So let's start with that. You can go first, Russell.
Yeah, well, like we were saying in our brief discussion before the recording started, when you stifle free speech, you actually don't allow the people to oppose or to bring about change within their society. You can also stifle the potentially good stuff that can be brought about by change. Simply, for instance, let's just use the extreme example in a given country where you have an absolute monarch or absolute dictator, and perhaps people don't necessarily want a change of monarch or a change of anything, but just want him or her or the individual to change a few policies. Don't do this, don't do that. If you don't have free speech, you can't garner support to oppose those ruling over you. Whether it be a democracy or an absolute monarch or a dictatorship, you just got no means of opposing anybody to bring around any effective change. You're not going to be able to change anything without free speech if you stifle it. That's one bad thing I can come up with that I believe is about it.
Well. Also, I think what you mentioned as well, Russell, is that this is a well-known thing across the liberal, libertarian, conservative lines and stuff. Is that generally what happens when you stifle things like free speech? Generally, it goes under and then comes up like a massive eruption eventually. Because people realize that they're not able to discuss those things openly. Even if they're difficult and offensive things to certain people, they're not able to discuss them in a public platform or out in the open. So they're forced to sort of retreat underground, and then they sort of hit, and then they just erupt like a massive volcano and all that, and then without directly alluding something, bullets fly and all kinds of shit hits the fan.
Yeah, well, basically, you don't allow an outlet for discussion, and then people feel alienated that they're not being heard and they lose it.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I think, and even in historic monarchies, people were able to petition the king, and
they were.
And monarchies historically, in some senses, actually were less restrictive in some regards than a lot of people think. And one of them was being able to petition for, our local lord has raised taxes and whatnot. Can you help us? We feel this is unjust. So there were checks on these sorts of things within a monarchical framework. But yeah, I think the dangers of, clamping down on speech too hard are sort of self-evident. We've been talking about, because if you have a situation where the elite are sort of running the show and you can't even legally question them, then you end up in a sort of USSR or North Korea style scenario where everyone's paranoid about everything and constantly watching their tongue, and no one wants to get purged.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think without monarchies aside and stuff, we don't really necessarily want to trigger Oaks too much, but you get what I'm saying. Like, you can't. It just. I understand that free speech is one thing, but then and being able to discuss difficult issues and stuff is one thing, but we're going to get to. Are we still going to get to the why free speech is not a good thing, right?
Yeah. No, so this is still under the big question. What happens when you stifle free speech? We're talking the bads now. Then we're going to go into the potential.
Yeah. Well, look. I mean, it's interesting you mention. Like I said, you just got to. It's about balancing powers, I think.
Yeah.
You can't. I think we don't give it. I think both. Your ultra conservatives and your ultra libertarians, anarchists, and that sort of thing say,
let them fight.
Anything can go. But there's lots of. All I'm saying is, in the like you said earlier, they were most in the old days the monarchies weren't the evil societies that we led to believe today. You know what I mean? We only hear of bad kings in our history books. We don't actually hear of any other things. You only hear of the bad kings.
You don't hear of the old good King Wenceslas lasses and stuff, eh?
Old good King Wenceslas lasses. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. So look, like I say, I'm not overly. Like Scott, I agree 100% with you. You can't suppress it, otherwise it comes up in all sorts of weird and strange. People it goes underground. Rather have everything above.
I'll be back in a sec, guys. Excuse me.
So that the public can decide whether they are in agreement with it or not.
Yeah. No, and I guess the other thing. So of course there's the issue of power. In terms of we regulate free speech and hold political entities, kings, and even large corporations accountable, right? There's also sort of the restrictive, just sort of personal freedom aspect. So let's say you are an artist who wants to mess around and create some sort of, degenerative art or whatever. Well, that might be bad for you then, but I think that sort of depends on a personal level. So I could foresee that there might be some maybe professions or individuals who would feel unduly restricted in creative enterprises that might have, of course, naturally problems with free speech restriction. But enough of the bad stuff. Let's get on to the good.
It sounds, Dylan. It sounds like because that's seriously triggering, hey? Because to the soy libertarians and all those. If you say things like there's a good reason to stifle free speech, they're like, what?
Yeah, and the thing is I think anybody who might be listening to this, and all of us would agree that you can't just give the state carte blanche to restrict anything, right? So if you have like an unaccountable body which is able to legislate away dissidents, that's obviously a big freaking problem. But so I guess the potential goods of no argument there, I think, from anybody. But the potential goods of stifling free speech. So one is degenerative. I listed here degenerative culture minimization. So now, again, to the more liberal-minded person listening to this, will of course be anathema. But, and I can only speak for myself, but I think there are certain, and it depends, let's put this under the category of speech for argument's sake. There are certain themes in society, pornography. Another example I might think of is like the effects of maybe certain kinds of music or films on cultures and whatnot. And I don't think it's entirely a good thing, all the stuff that happens. The influence that Hollywood and major motion picture film has, and free pornography available all over the place. These are serious concerns that I think people have to contend with. And anybody who has a more traditionalist or nationalist outlook will have questions about how to resolve them. And one way, obviously, is placing restrictions on their issuance in the first place, right? So if it's illegal, so if you have what do you call them? What are they called? Decency laws. So in the United States, although there was no federal ban on this sort of stuff, freedom of speech was originally conceived of as existing for exactly the reasons that we said. People should be able to criticize their government. You should have freedom of the press. People should be aware of the things going on. Things shouldn't be kept secret. There should be, vigorous public discourse. But just about, I think, about every state in the Union, at some point or another, had decency laws. And this was the case in Hollywood, and this naturally would apply in California. And so basically, up until the 1950s, there was no legal pornography, by and large. Playboy, I think they actually had a case in like the 60s. I can't remember. I don't know the exact history of Playboy. I learned all this a while ago. But when they actually, it was a big sort of case at the time in order to get these sorts of laws, which had for hundreds of years been considered, illegal, or to get these sorts of laws which had been considered perfectly legal within a state framework, rescinded, so that pornography could be made. So we have cases of societies which did allow for the U.S. as in terms of pornography and stuff, without sacrificing the ability to change local representation.
So I think Dylan, you're bang on there, because I don't think people actually. You see, the argument. You mentioned decency laws and stuff. I think the argument that most sort of liberals and libertarians and your average conservative would bring to the table is who gets to decide what decent is. You understand what I'm saying? That who writes the rules, kind of thing. We all know as Christians who writes the rules. There's no questioning that. There's no what's wise and stuff, but they don't really understand that. And it's not only pornography. It's things like subtle things like things on TV. It's things like this is not quite subtle, but it's things like what's happening in the States and like places like California with drag queens going to read storybooks to children. I mean, is that sort of expression really necessary? I mean, you see, this is the whole thing. And what libertarians and liberals and stuff, what they'll argue is that's a form of expression, and that needs to form part of absolute expressionism, like your ability to express yourself. And if you stifle that, then you're stifling free speech as all. That's their argument.
Yeah, that's. I'll just interject there for a second. That just really freaks me out about liberals and libertarians and their free speech absolutism. There is just no ways that, say, for the First Amendment, the way you read it in the U.S. Constitution, all right, meant anything that would be that would allow freedom, just do as you please type of thing. There's just no ways. There's just
not a chance. Not a chance.
That promotion of obscenity in television and radio and in the printed press and all this sort of thing there's just no ways that can be seen as freedom of expression and freedom of speech and all that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
no, you're right.
Obviously, we're just looking at the US example in their First Amendment. There is just no ways. I'm sorry. I cannot. I just don't know how the hell they managed to make that connection. It freaks me out.
Yeah.
Well, that's what liberalism is, Russell. That's what liberalism leads to. It gives people the ultimate power to sort of degenerate, to decline, to fall into that that flow of just.
Yeah. And I guess the thing too is the we talk about and of course, for anyone listening, we'll talk. We're not here to talk about liberalism in general. We'll get there, but the problem is with this free speech, like everything should be allowed. Essentially, it's essentially a sort of nihilistic.
It's absolutely nihilistic, 100%.
You don't have your society doesn't have a conception of what the good is, and as such, everything is permissible. Any kind of expression is permissible, and the very framework of it, it's a belief in nothing. It's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
It's like everything should be allowed, and
it's
I think the very framework upon which it's based is, in the end, kind of nihilistic.
Well, it's not, Dylan. It's not conducive with human nature.
Look, that's the other thing is that people with that type of liberal attitude, you take a nihilistic sort of worldview and together with liberalism. I mean, the thing is, then you've got an explosive situation.
Yeah, and I think. As we've seen in sort of Western societies, and this ties in directly to the liberalism argument, is I think liberalism in general becomes nihilistic. And here's my point. So in the United States has always had the First Amendment of the Constitution. Always. It was written there in the Bill of Rights, and nobody had a problem with it. First there was the Federalists, and then there was the Democratic Republicans, who then became the Democrats, and then there was the Whigs, and there was the Republicans, and you had the know-nothings. You had all sorts of parties in the United States, and vigorous political discourse and strong opinions, but it was within a Christian framework. Okay, which is why you could reconcile having the First Amendment with decency laws and straight up blasphemy laws in some states, right? So they weren't seen as being it wasn't an either or thing. It was a both. There was an understanding within the society, and the laws never changed. The Constitution didn't change itself, right? And it's not one of those living, breathing sort of document. I mean, the Constitution's only as good as the society that has the Constitution. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And Koos Malan, actually, who's a legal scholar here in South Africa, Koos Malan, and he was making essentially this point that the Constitution, any constitution anywhere, is never understood outside of a worldview, right?
Exactly.
So whether it's the leading party who has sort of like a monopoly on everything, or if the society in general changes over time, you don't have to even amend the Constitution. It will change itself de facto. You know what I mean?
Correct. 100%. Correcto.
Yeah. So,
in other words, what I'm saying is, if you look at it, I mean, the thing is, I think all this weird interpretation of the First Amendment only happened since the early '60s.
Yeah, and
I mean,
that's
they even managed Roe to get Roe versus Wade being deemed unconstitutional. You know what I mean?
yeah.
It's just
There's
madness.
all sorts of stuff like that. So I guess, yeah, the good things, degenerative culture minimization, and
Yeah, so that is definitely a good thing. But now you know the arguments that are going to be brought forward. I think it's important that we look at what those arguments are going to be, and because those are legitimate criticisms, and I guess we need to, if we want to sort of grow as reactionary Christian conservatives, we have to find out what the criticism will be and take it as it is and learn from that criticism. So the criticisms that are going to come out of this is that we literally are going to be dubbed as sounding like Nazis or something. No, I mean it's just you understand what I'm saying, like stifling any sort of free speech to any liberal or libertarian is going to sound like us trying to use the force of the state on people, and you know what I mean, and then we're going to sound like we're fascists.
yeah. Well, and the thing is like, to all the potential liberal audience out there, I don't even know politically where I fall these days. I used to be an anarcho-capitalist until very recently, and I don't know exactly what I am. So for those of you who are worried of,
I think myself, Russell, and you can both say that actually.
yeah. I mean, these days I'm like, I see the inherent problems of the political structure as it exists, and I don't trust the state modern format. But then I look back in the history a little bit. I'm like, monarchy, was it really so bad?
I don't trust the democratic state.
Yeah.
I'm at the point right now, Dylan. It's where I'm quite happy to go live in a monarch society without any political rights, provided certain. I'll live in a place without any political rights.
Just because the lines are written. The lines are drawn.
I know the lines. I can kind of navigate my way through it, and I can understand learn to understand the society that I'm in. Even if I'm absolute ethno-linguistic minority type of thing, you know what I mean. There's no shifting goalposts. You know exactly what you're in for.
Yeah. No, and I guess so. The natural, what would you say? The natural objections to this would be, from the libertarian angle. Well, you shouldn't be able to tell other people what to do and all that stuff. And okay, fair enough on their own property. But I would posit this, and this sort of ties into sort of our next question. Is free speech absolutism? And this ties back into the arguments that we'll inevitably hear about how any kind of stifling free speech is bad. So this we'll leave the objections for now, and we'll go into the next question, which will tie into it.
Yeah.
Is free speech absolutism sustainable? The first thing I wrote down is no, absolutely not. It is not sustainable, and you just need to look around you. So, well, I guess, of course, first it depends what kind of free speech you're talking about, right? So again, most societies in the West have been accommodating, even ones with blasphemy laws, right? And we were talking about that before the stream started. There's places now to this day, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Poland, that have blasphemy laws on the books. And they don't have a problem with, voting in and out this party or that. So, but do we have free speech now? No. We do not. And it's not sustainable, and it's never been proven to be sustainable. Right now, it's just controlled by other means, right? So, like in South Africa, for instance, you can, or in the United States. I'm just going to use the United States because it's a good example because of how robust the legal protections are for free speech. But even then, in the United States, you simply cannot publicly hold certain opinions and be allowed in polite society. You just can't. You cannot, get in a controversial subject such as race, or you cannot, some more out there opinions, you cannot be a national socialist, or you cannot. I'm serious.
You can't go and register a political party called the National Socialist Workers Party of the USA.
Actually, it's funny you say that. There's I think there actually is I think it's called like the Southern Agrarian Workers Party or something. I don't know, but my point is if you take these social media platforms, for instance, if we wanted to, we could get ourselves kicked off Twitter easily. If we wanted to, we could have a hate mob rallied against us and be hounded out of society easily. If we wanted to, we could say things that would get us all fired easily. So we don't have free speech right now. So what are you guys worried about?
Well, exactly. This is the thing.
Yeah.
Look, like I said, usually I think the problem is you don't want to make, I think, like what you said, being allowed in polite society, society still punishes people internally, you know what I mean? So there's enough punishment within the normal course of society. There don't need to be penal offences. They don't need to be people to be brought into courts of law. They're already judged in the public sphere of ideas.
Sure.
Found to be wanting.
Sure, but Russell, where that gets slippery is when the moment that the public sphere or society starts to judge those people, and those views that those people are judging are, so basically, let's say for example, the whole trannies going to read stories, tranny puppet show or whatever. They, you can't say that's bad. People are going to shun you. They're going to say "Wow, why is it bad?" and stuff. And
I get what you're saying.
You know what I mean?
In other words,
now in social
society is no longer a decent society anyway.
Yeah.
So why are they judging it?
Yeah, exactly.
So the thing is, society but I suppose the stage where we are now, the society is already corrupted. That they call good evil and evil good.
Yeah. No, and this is just the whole ridiculous, framework that a lot of liberals have, unfortunately, is they'll say, on the one hand, they'll say, hey, whatever, you do you, man, it's all good. Just Big Lebowski style, just, hey, I'll do me, you do you, that's fine.
Mm.
And on the other hand, they'll say, hey, you can't restrict what other people say, or you can't say that about this protected group at the time, whoever they might be, trannies or minorities in America or whatever. And I'm like, hang on, those two statements are inherent contradictions in and of themselves. On the one hand, it's like, yeah, people should be allowed to do and be whatever they want. And on the other hand, except
yeah. But
and that's the inherent contradiction of liberal thinking.
Yeah, it's like Dylan. It's like free speech
with no value.
Yeah, free speech. Absolutism is great, but
yeah, exactly.
So that's exactly the crux of the
and thing. Also free speech absolutism, that sort of view means that people that look, like I said, it doesn't have to be the extreme things with the transgenderism issue or anything like that, but just mean just society can get corrupted where somebody which would have been perfectly decent speech 50 years ago is now complete hate speech in the current era.
Sure. Yeah. So how do you go about preserving or conserving, for that matter, that sort of environment? What's the best way to conserve that?
Somehow you just have to change society.
Monarchy and theocracy. That's how.
Well, I don't even know in today's world. Up until 50 odd years ago, I would have agreed with you. But I don't. I just the levels of powers that have been handed over to various states and media houses to push whatever agenda they feel. That the resources at their disposal are quite phenomenal.
Yeah, oh, that's true. And and again, these, I guess, sort of to tie it back to the is free speech absolutism sustainable? Again, like I would say, I'm just tying it back to the critiques to throw a lasso around this. But yes, no, they are not sustainable. And again, the critiques that, hey, you can't restrict what people say from a pragmatic perspective, right? We already have restrictions on our speech through other means, through political or media influence of the culture. And this gets back into the, the effect that media, in terms of film, news broadcasts, or anything else, has on shaping society's outlook is profound. And if these institutions have the ability to sway, if you allow them the ability to sway public opinion, they inevitably will, and they already have.
Yeah.
So their resources they've got incredible amount of resource at their disposal to manufacture consent.
Yeah. Right, and I guess, and from the libertarian argument, they'll say, NAP, don't violate, the non-aggression principle, and for the only people who make that position who I take seriously are religious individuals. Because, and we'll save this for another time, but an atheist telling me, hey man, non-aggression principle, why? I mean,
yeah, what for?
By what basis do you say this? Because at the end of the day, it's just your opinion, man. So
yeah,
and in which case, I'll ignore you and keep my opinion because I have no moral reason to change it, right? So, and then you could come in at the pragmatic angle, but then, all right, so, hey, free speech, the pragmatic, I'll say, well, you can't restrict free speech on pragmatic grounds. Well, is that the case? If you are going to make a sort of more utilitarian argument, is society better off having an absolutist free expression or not? Well, that entirely depends on what your worldview and values are, right? And that's going to, if you ask a Muslim guy, or you ask a Presbyterian, or an Orthodox Christian, or an atheist, or like a liberal Christian who works at a libertarian think tank, they're all going to have different ideas about what the optimal society is. And by necessity, there's going to be different ways to get there. So for the theocrat, obviously, no, free speech is not wanted. board required. Even for the old school, like American Republican. I mean, like colonial American who was part of the early Republic. That's what I mean by Republican. Full free expression a good thing? No. This undermines our Christian society and puts us, in the crosshairs of demonic forces, and this leads to the other thing, foreign influence. Again, what happens when you stifle free speech. Under good, I listed less foreign influence. So naturally, of course, that can be a bad thing, right? If you're you want you want foreign influence. If you are China, you probably want a bit of foreign influence. If you're South Africa, you probably want a little bit of foreign influence at this point. But if you are, let's say, your society in general is happy with the way things are going, right? Let's say they are a religious society who has, political debate, but some decency laws and whatnot, and then you start allowing, like foreign smut to be smuggled in or whatever. All of a sudden, that sort of changes the dynamic of that society.
Correct.
So, and by nature, you end up opening yourself up to foreign influence, either culturally or even politically. So.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's just my thing is. We've discussed about free speech, but there has to be, I think, what can underpin free speech well is a uniformity of basic uniformal truths that are self-evident within a given population. So in other words, if you could say, like, you take a country, say, different to ours, say, or different to a non-Western country. You take a place like, say, Iran, for instance, okay? They might have issues with their current leadership, for instance, okay? But they're not going to turn their whole society upside down in the name of change and progress.
Yeah.
Because they're all sold into it, you know what I mean? Well, they're all vested in it. They might really want to change the current government that's ruling over them, but they do not wish to have their whole society turned on its head and that sort of thing. They want to continue being Iranians in Iran, along that, and Persians that they have been for hundreds and centuries and thousands of years. They just want change of
just hang on there, Russell.
Yeah.
Just hang on there. D-Dog, do you have power there? The power cut there?
No, I do. I was just turning the light down just because it seemed like it was washing everything out. So.
Oh, okay. No, I was just wondering because it looked like load shedding Eskom hit you there or something.
No. Thank God.
Yeah.
But you get what I'm saying. The society needs to, amongst themselves. Once you've got that base, all right, then we can start talking about allowing. Then you can start implementing things like decency laws to protect the society, because everybody's going to agree with it. Then you can start implementing all the different things that you can actually put in for protection, so that people know the general consensus in the society is that those are there for their protection.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. It's like it's kind of like if you can pass a certain critical mass, all right, where you can actually build up your once you've taken enough of the battlefield within a society, or the society's been built in such a way. You take an old society like Iran, for instance, Persia. They built it up. It's got to a point where there's always going to be a strong national consensus.
You know what, Russell? You know what? You say that and that, but now you're using extreme examples like Iran and sort of the Asian countries and all that. But a subtle, simple example. Dylan, you can correct me if I'm wrong over here. But what I picked up with my time in the States and stuff is a subtle example is actually the US. It might not be as sort of uniform and as big a consensus and stuff, but an example of it is the United States. I mean, I remember in my time spent in the States is I remember very specifically there sort of being some sort of, I don't know if I would call it uniformity or something, but there was some sort of connection and similarity between different families and stuff that I met in the US, and a lot of them shared very very uniform or similar sort of thoughts. But I don't know if that's now becoming a thing of the past in the States.
I think it really depends on the area, you know.
But I mean, the thing is, look, the reason why I used the extreme example of Iran is I was trying to show how a nation sort of builds, it develops, it changes, it goes through. You know what I mean? I'm trying to build a bit of a picture. I know that other countries. I'm trying to select something where how to conserve your. The only way you can conserve a society is through a national consensus. And that's unfortunately, unless there can be a national consensus, you can't actually have any type of what we are trying to what we've mentioned here, what Dylan mentioned, like they had in the States with decency laws and all that sort of thing. Unless there's that national consensus of things, right?
Yeah.
You can't actually implement those laws. You can't actually have that so-called legalized conservatism.
Yeah. No. So and that's the other thing too is you kind of have to live in a. I think what we said. What did we say before? The previous conversation we had. South Africa is not a nation state.
No, it's a state of nations. Yeah.
Yeah. And once you're dealing in a large, multi-ethnic, multicultural society, it becomes a bit more difficult, right?
Exactly.
But in some places, like where religion is able to supersede that, and by religion I mean sort of a unified religion, not necessarily. What do I mean? So not religious in plural, but sort of a unified religious framework. You are able to have some degree of consensus about these issues in terms of like maybe obscenity laws, right?
Oh yes, yeah, definitely.
So basically,
you would have to have the only if you have a society, you would still need to have you'd still need if you were going to have a sort of a multi-ethnic type environment, you would need a strong religious thing to keep everybody together.
Absolutely. And the one example I could kind of think of off the top of my head is Brazil. Brazil is a very multi-ethnic society. There's, I think, something about a third of the country is white, about a third of the country is black, or mulatto, and then there's the rest are split between black and indigenous Brazilians. What do they all have in common? They're all Catholic.
Correct.
So,
and not only that, Dylan, they all speak Portuguese.
Yeah, they're all Catholic. They all speak Portuguese, and guess what? They don't allow abortion or blasphemy law.
Well, see, there you go.
Oh, they do have blasphemy laws in Brazil as well, right?
I was just looking at the map before we began our conversation, and yes, let me go back here. Blasphemy laws by the world. Brazil does indeed have blasphemy laws. It has fines and restrictions. So they vary by severity from country to country. So Saudi Arabia has death sentences. Other ones have prison sentences. Brazil has fines and restrictions.
Oh, okay.
So they will literally fine you or put like legal restrictions. Hey, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that.
I suppose. Look, that's. I don't know necessarily that I would really be able to get behind, fining or putting someone in prison for blasphemy and stuff. But I mean, look.
I was just using this as an example of a multi-ethnic, multiracial society that is able to have some sort of decency, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
No, but you also, I mean, the thing is,
on speech.
another interesting thing which you mentioned, we mentioned two things that they keep them in unity in Brazil is religion and language. We seem to underestimate the impact of language on culture and thought process. All right. You notice it in how can I put it? If you look at it in South Africa, all right, a language is a big dividing thing. A lot of, for instance, how can I put this? You must remember that. How can I put it? Those that have English or Afrikaans as their first mother tongue, all right, have got a very clear. It's almost like the language in and of itself, because of its literature, it gives it very clear guidance. So, in other words, even though myself and Scott have being Anglophones in Africa, for instance, our culture is incredibly similar to the Anglophone in the rest of the world, like a Canadian or an Australian or a New Zealander or an American.
Yeah.
Culture and outlook is very, very much dependent upon language. All right, and I think we kind of underestimate language is not just a spoken word. Which it's another reason why, and that's also another reason why in the 60s, I think it was, when the West Indies, when they had the first wave of immigrants to the UK from the West Indies, right? Because of the infusion of language over the years into Caribbean culture and what comes with language as well, the integration of the people from the West Indies into UK society was pretty seamless.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, a little bit of things here and there, but generally, it was not nearly as. It would not nearly have been as problematic if you had taken a group, the same amount of group from, say, the Congo or Nigeria.
Didn't a very similar sort of thing happen with the Indian population that immigrated to the UK as well?
Yeah, but look, I don't know. I think the West Indian sort of culture had a lot more kind of, because of the language, had a lot more English influence. I mean, with regards to things like all the gentlemanly side of things and the cricket and the this and the that. You get what I'm saying? But I'm using that as an example. India, to an extent, as well.
Culturally appropriated more.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the thing is, in those days, also back in the 1950s, 60s, most of your Caribbeans would either have been, unless they were, if they were from Jamaica or Barbados and that sort of thing, would probably have been either Church of England or Roman Catholic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So infuse that with the language, the religion, all those sorts of things. Their integration into the UK was not really an issue.
Or not nearly as much of an issue as someone from a much more alien culture. Yeah.
For instance, somebody from Pakistan.
Right. Exactly. And then that comes with a different set of values, different theological framework, different worldview, different language. Yeah. I
think we underplay the importance of language.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that, and it's no surprise that all my buddies in South Africa speak English. So I mean, it's just the way it is,
So Dylan, next, I think we've been going for about an hour now and stuff. So the final topic, I think it was what
speech, if any, is bad.
Yeah, what speech, if any, is bad?
Again, that entirely depends on your worldview, and it also depends on what you mean by speech, right?
Correct.
What you mean by free speech, and speech more broad. So then you start trying to out-lawyer each other, and you're like, all right, so is pornography free speech? Is criticizing your government free speech? Is running an opposition party free speech? Is donating to a political campaign considered free speech? Then we start getting into legal.
Is tranny puppet shows free speech?
Tranny puppet shows free speech.
Well, that's not free speech.
It's not.
Exactly. This is my point. So I think this gets to your, again, I just so everyone's clear here, I don't think anyone here means not being able to criticize the government. I think all of us sort of hold the sort of more old school conception of what the First Amendment of the United States was and what it was meant to be, right?
100%.
That you're able to criticize the existing institutions, non-opposition, and whatnot, but it's not a cultural revolutionary ideology.
I think Dylan, I think it's important to say this, is that I think that we, as I guess the three of us, I'm not going to speak for you guys, but I think the three of us, I think it's safe to say that I think the three of us, when you said the sort of old school view of freedom of speech and stuff, is that we believe that you should be free to, like, discourse should be free. Sure, like you should be able to discuss difficult issues and talk about these things and that sort of thing. But I don't believe that you should have the freedom to sort of
build a strip club next to a school.
Yeah, to sort of, I don't know, to fall into degeneracy. That's basically what I'm saying, is to just totally. I mean, if free speech absolutism actually existed and people and society was okay with free speech absolutism, there would be outside of school walking around naked and stuff, and they'd say, "This is my expression. This is what I want to." It doesn't exist. You can't have free speech absolutism, because absolutism is not a percentage. It's 100%. It's the full Monty or nothing at all.
No, and I think in that sense, whether you're a libertarian who's a big fan of the idea of free speech absolutism, or a liberal who's favorable to that position, or a misguided and worthless modern conservative,
yeah.
This idea of free speech absolutism, the more you look at it, the more ridiculous it is. As I said, it doesn't exist. It hasn't existed. It never will exist.
No offense to our autistic viewers out there, but it should be called free speech absolute autistic.
Free speech autism.
Yeah, free speech absolute autism.
Yeah, people aren't math formulas. 1 + 1 does not equal free speech. It's never worked like that.
It's just
so I guess going back. So it depends on what you mean by speech. So if we boil it down to more expression, what speech, if any, is bad. Now, this depends on your values, right? So if you are a liberal-minded individual, well, you'll say anything's permissible, right? Or it should be.
Yeah.
But again, the problem with that is it's a nihilistic assumption, And it eventually leads to that. And societies where you see who sort of have this ethos, they tend to go down this way. Highly, declining birth rates, low population growth, social alienation. In the U.S. right now, you're seeing a massive epidemic of substance abuse, people dying from heroin, like all over the place. The life expectancy has actually gone down because of fentanyl and opioids. So, and I can't help but feel that is somehow tied to the spirit of the age, right? To this liberal framework where it's like, our values are freedom. Okay, now what? I'm free to, whack off the porn in my basement, live in my mom's house, not be able to get a wife, and then OD on fentanyl. I'm free to do that. Okay, cool. It's one of those things where it entirely depends. You cannot have the liberal position on free speech is basically it's an amoral position. See what I'm saying? Except in the contradictory nature that the only moral position is that there is no moral position on free speech. You see what I'm saying?
Well, look, it's one of those things that irritate me about. We all want to be as free as we possibly can, all right? But at the same time, you're not supposed to. You have to actually value. You actually have to value what you have and what you believe, and where you come from and where you're going and all that sort of thing. Otherwise, you can very easily fall into that nihilistic viewpoint where you just anything kind of goes and.
Well, Russell, the only way to really value something is to look after it.
Well, this is the thing. You're supposed to. The thing is that's where if you take how they used to speak when they used to speak of a country or a nation in the old days, they used to speak of it in such a way that it was just merely an extension of your own family.
Yeah.
And that you needed to. Everybody was vested in, and you needed to. You basically needed to protect yourself first. You needed to take care of yourself, take responsibility for your own actions. All right, first and foremost, you were responsible, and then you would also be responsible to, as far as you could, care for the needs of others. You were supposed to take responsibility for your own actions, and then also, your peers and all that sort of thing. You're all in it together, type of thing. And the problem with liberalism is it's so overly, ridiculously become that way.
Yeah.
So ridiculously individualistic that people can't even take care of themselves anymore, let alone each other.
Well, Russell. This is the issue. This is the issue that I've had with liberalism for a while now, since I've grown up and become a man and stuff. But I've seen all my friends that identified as liberals, not liberalists, liberals, and the majority of them don't believe in personal responsibility. They don't believe that it's
your first problem. What society can be developed? What possible chance have you got of a society developing on any type of normal lines if people don't either take responsibility for their own lives internally, like I'm going to take, or societal pressure coming on them to change their lives? How do you build a society?
Well, Russell Oakes just need to get moved a bit, man.
Yeah, well, look, this thing is, you're supposed to take responsibility for your own life and your own thing. And then if you do not, the society at large, I mean, that
Are going to shun you.
family and friends are supposed to correct you and bring you through.
Absolutely.
And that is the whole idea. And the problem is, if you can't even take care of yourself correctly, all right, and everybody in society just has that lackadaisical sort of, okay, whatever, you really can't build anything, unfortunately. You can't, nothing can be built that way, let alone anything preserved.
100%. So, guys, I think this has been a very interesting conversation, very interesting chat. What I want to do is I want to give you each like a minute for sort of closing statements, and then we'll cut it off, I guess.
Yep.
It's been a good hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes now. So, D-Dog, you want to go first, bro?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, again, this all ties into, I guess I'll just sort of tie it off with this. So, what speech, if any, is bad, right? It all boils down to this. So, I think it's really important to first understand where you're coming from. By what basis do you derive your values? Is it even coherent? And if not, then you need to be asking other questions than why, whether or not all expression should be legal at all times and under all circumstances. So, for an Orthodox Christian like myself, then I got other concerns that, a dope smoking hippie might not,
Yeah.
So then I have concerns about, pornography. I have concerns about theological, religious subversion in society. And, it's just sort of finding the best way to sort of balance all these things. And it's one of the problems with living in a large, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, religiously diverse country where everyone's just going to butt heads about these things. And you can't have, a massive consensus on cultural issues like in Greece or, Georgia and the Caucasus. like old Georgia, man.
I think I want to move to Georgia.
Yeah. I actually hear that Georgia has taken a surprising amount of Afrikaner farmers.
Yeah, I did read about that as well.
One of the larger emigre destinations today. And for no reason, they're extremely right-wing culturally and theocratic. So in that sort of society, it's much more easy to gain consensus. So I think sort of my goal first would be to see the society I live in Christianized around me, or re-Christianized for that matter. And then from there, we can have effective discussions about what sort of structure we want to see, what sort of world is in line with, the Bible and God's commandments and stuff, and how that.
Spot on. Russell, you want to give some closing statements? Some closing statements.
You're struggling with your language tonight.
Yeah, I'm tired, bro. I'm exhausted.
You should be free to say clothing however he wants, right?
Yeah, should be free to say clothing. Stop being such a fascist, Russell.
Yeah.
I can't, look, right now, in a country like South Africa, I do not believe for the rest of my lifetime that we're going to be able to reach consensus on what is free speech. I don't believe that. It's a sad reality. But as it stands now, the way looking at it, I don't think we can actually reach consensus simply because we are a unitary state in which all these different complexities are prevalent and very real in regards to languages and cultures and religions and all sorts of things. They are very, very real. Um, and I don't think we can reach a full consensus where we're going to be able to have free speech. So we're probably going to stumble around a little bit all over the place for the foreseeable future. And what Dylan said, it would be best if we could Christianize the society around us. We might have a better shot at things. Other than that,
those are going to be triggered by that, bro.
Within my framework of the way I view it, it's like what you said, in places like Georgia, for instance, it's easy to reach a free speech consensus and have a peaceful society. And the ability, you can only have free speech where there is enough consensus as what is free speech. You know what I mean?
Spot
you probably
on.
find in Saudi Arabia, what we think they're putting death to people is quite okay for blasphemy. You know what I mean? For them, they think that's fine. But there's consensus. So within their framework, maybe, I wouldn't call it free speech, but nonetheless, they've got some sort of consensus, It's not good. We might find it whatever, but unfortunately, that is within their... It's their issue to resolve within their country, type of thing. You know what I mean?
Bang on.
That's what I'm saying. Just to summarize, I don't believe in absolute free speech. I don't believe in the free speech can be obtained without a national consensus.
I think you're bang on, Russell. I think your consensus argument is really spot on, but I also think that I think the whole liberal and libertarian view of free speech is very sort of simplified, and they like to sort of have this let them fight kind of attitude where they just throw things at people and say, whatever, man, we'll just see what happens and stuff. And I think that's quite destructive. You know what I mean? And I think that's not in a society like South Africa where consensus can never be agreed on. It's going to cause serious problems and troubles. So if you say things like absolute freedom of expression, I very vehemently disagree with that, because absolute freedom of expression in a society like South Africa, where you cannot, because it's so culturally diverse along tribal lines, along cultural lines, along every line, you cannot have you cannot just throw that to the wind and see how it pans out. It's going to end up in an incredibly horrible way, especially when you're saying things like freedom of expression. It's just a
country like South Africa,
it's just a dangerous cocktail, and I think we need to be very careful about it. How are we going to go about solving those problems and solving those consensus issues and stuff is going to be a very tricky one. And I think that throughout our various discussions, I think we'll start getting closer to some answers. I think like Dylan said earlier on, that we're not quite sure where we fall and stuff. We know that we're all Christian and stuff, and we like to be the best sort of conservative Christians that we can be, but we are learning, and this is the exact reason why we have these discussions and stuff, is learn from each other and learn from other circles and stuff. Talking about circles, I don't want this to turn into one big sort of circle jerk, even though we know that this is if you want to be involved in a circle jerk, this is probably the best circle jerk to be involved in. It sounds horrible, but anyway.
But I'm sure we'll have ones where there's vehement disagreement. Maybe we can have like Calvinism versus Roman Catholicism that I see someday or something.
That should trigger that should trigger some Russell into some triggered argument over there. Check him. Hey, Russell. So I think we should end it off there, lads. But it's been awesome chatting with you guys. Next week, Tuesday, we're going to be recording another podcast. I'm not sure exactly what the subject or the topic of discussion is going to be. I think a new interesting one might be the ZACP, which is quite an interesting ad over here. What do you think, Dylan?
Yeah, that might be an interesting topic.
I think so.
I can assure you the opinions will be reactionary, though. So
no, it's fine. It's good. It's good because what we can look at is we can look at their policies and see how reactionary they really are. I doubt they're very reactionary, but
yeah, I think before we talk, this is kind of interesting because most of it's very kind of rare that you see critiques of these sorts of things coming from more right-wing sources, I guess. So I think we're filling a much needed niche.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're correct. That the circle jerkers have been allowed to circle jerk themselves for too long.
Too long. Too long. We're also going to have to come up with a catchphrase or something.
We have a catchphrase. Dios food.
Or I was thinking maybe you could end it with like, "Thank you for listening. This has been Reactionary Opinions" or something. And the rest of them can just yell, "God wills it."
Okay, let's try it. First run. Thank you for listening to Reactionary Opinions, all our listeners, ladies, gentlemen, transgenders, bisexuals, gays, all of you out there. It's been lovely hanging out with you on this Tuesday evening, the 19th of March. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you found anything that you would like to mention, just put it down in the comments below. And thank you so much for hanging out with us. And Russell.
Yeah.
God wills it.
God wills it.
Cheers, lads. Cheers. Good night. Cheers. Bye.